I want to share a story with you as I close. The story of Peter Norman. Peter Norman grew up in a working class district of Melbourne, Australia. And as a young boy, he couldn't afford the kit to play Australian football, his favorite sport. But his father somehow managed to borrow a second-hand pair of running spikes, and his talent for sprinting was quickly recognized. Yet Norman was still an obscure pick when the 28-year-old arrived in the high altitude of Mexico City. This was the first time that he had run on an Olympic standard track, but he thrived in thin air. Recalling the experience, he said, "I could feel my knees bouncing around my chin. It lengthened my stride by 4 inches." But here's the thing. It wasn't these events, it was the events off the track, however, that dominated the lead-up story to the 1968 Olympics. In the US, the civil rights movement fought running battles with the police and army across America against segregation and racism. At this time, both Martin Luther King Jr. and President Kennedy had been assassinated, and the Vietnam War was raging. Meanwhile, in Mexico, hundreds of protesting students were massacred in the run-up to the games. The regime covered up their deaths, and the athletes arrived. And it says that it goes on, it says, Australia, too, was in the midst of this racial strife. The country's White Australia policy had provoked protests of its own. It put heavy restrictions upon non-white immigration and a raft of prejudicial laws against the indigenous Aboriginal people, including a policy of taking Aboriginal children from their birth parents and handing them to white couples for adoption, a practice that continued until the 1970s. You'll see a picture here captured at the medal ceremony for the men's 200 meters at the 1968 Mexico Olympics, which features U.S. sprinter Tommy Smith as he stands defiantly, head bowed, and his black-gloved fist thrust into the air. Behind him, fellow American John Carlos joins with his own Black Power salute, an act of defiance aimed at highlighting the segregation and racism burning back in the homeland. It was this act that scandalized the Olympics in the eyes of the leaders there. Smith and Carlos were sent home as a disgrace and banned from the Olympics for life. But they were treated as returning heroes by the Black community for sacrificing their personal glory for the cause. Yet, few know the man standing in front of both of them, the Australian sprinter Peter Norman, who shocked the world by powering past Carlos and winning the silver medal. Here's the part that got everyone stirred up. On his left breast, he wore a small badge that read, Olympic Project for the Human Rights, an organization that was opposed to racism. But while Smith and Carlos are now feted as human rights pioneers, the badge was enough to effectively end Norman's career. He returned home to Australia as a pariah, suffering unofficial sanction and ridicule as the Black Power salutes forgotten man. He never ran in the Olympics again. Norman retired from the athletics immediately after hearing he had been cut from Munich's team. He would never return to the track. Neither would his achievements count for much 28 years later when Sydney hosted the 2000 Olympics. Michael Norman said that he wasn't even invited to participate in any capacity. There was no outcry, and yet he was the greatest Olympic sprinter in our history. And sadly, he died in 2006 before his story was made popular in the movie Salute. But here's the point of the story. At his funeral, both Smith and Carlos gave the eulogy, and both men helped to carry his coffin before it was lowered into the ground. Why? Because for them, that little badge on his chest was not an act of defiance, but for them, Norman was a hero. Norman was a soldier, a lone soldier who stood with them understanding their plight and all that was going on in their day. For his small but determined stand against racism, he was their hero. So I ask you today, how are you using your voice?